So today's video will be going over the basic anatomy and prosection of an enucleation specimen. Now the specimen I have before me actually contains a little bit extra soft tissue and isn't a true enucleation specimen. So the first thing we notice externally is the eyelid here. The eyelid is going to be covered with skin on the outside and mucosa on the inside. The inner portion of mucosa is referred to as conjunctiva. There's two portions of conjunctiva. You have the inner lining of the eyelid, which is the palpebral conjunctiva, and then you have conjunctiva, which is overlying the orbit, referred to as bulbar conjunctiva. And the conjunctiva is actually overlying the sclera. So you have a nice thin mucosal layer overlying before we get to that white portion known as sclera. Additionally, if we try to orient, you can see we have canthuses on either side. This is where the two eyelids come together. So if we wanted to orient the structure, based off what you see here, that's going to be very difficult. A couple of structures we can use to orient, though, in this structure is there's a glandular component here. You can kind of see how hard that is, and that's our lacrimal gland. And lacrimal glands are going to be found laterally. So we know that this is going to be a left eye, right? So if we try to place it in our body or use our point of reference, we have the lacrimal gland over here. So that means this is our lateral canthus, and this is our medial canthus. If we turn the eye and look posteriorly, we can start to see our orbit muscles coming off. And these can be used for orientation if you get an orbit resection, but usually for an enucleation specimen that we'll see when we get a little bit closer, a lot of these musculatures will not be attached or visible clearly. But knowing that this is going to be our superior avenue with our lacrimal gland, we know that we have our superior rectus muscle here, our superior oblique, you can kind of see heading over. We have our inferior rectus, our lateral rectus, and our medial rectus right here. So those can be helpful for orientation. Additionally, you can see the optic nerve here. It's kind of blackened in this particular specimen, and we'll go into, when we look at prosection, that'll become important for that. And then let's see if we can find our inferior oblique muscle. It looks like it might actually be this guy here. So we've got medial rectus, lateral rectus. Yeah, it looks like oblique, and then inferior rectus down here. Inferior medial. So again, if those muscles are present, you can try to use them to orient your specimen, but oftentimes when you get the enucleation, you won't see those. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the skin and soft tissue from this specimen, and we'll look at what an enucleation specimen should look like. So this is what you can expect to see with your enucleation specimen. Notice there's not a lot of soft tissue attached, and there's scant amounts of musculature. Honestly, you can often use the muscles to orient your specimen, but we can go ahead and try. I tried to leave some attached, but don't worry about it. Typically, orientation on these specimens is not critical unless they did it in the surgical suite, or if you happen to notice any sort of extension of tumor into the surrounding sclera. But let's go ahead and take a look. So there's two key features we can use to orient these specimens. Posteriorly, we notice there's a posterior ciliary vessel, which is going to be kind of inferior to your optic nerve on the medial side. And we can say like that little structure there looks like a vessel. That may be it. You might not often see these on the specimens you receive in your surgical pathology lab. So it might not be as helpful for orienting, but it's something to look for. Additionally, your orbit muscles can be helpful for orientation. So medial, lateral, inferior, and superior rectus muscles look very identical. The main orienting factors are going to be your obliques. So we should have a superior oblique and an inferior oblique. Now those are going to be initially attached starting on the lateral aspect and then moving medially. So it looks like if we see this as either superior or inferior rectus, we've got a muscle to the side of it where its muscle fibers look like they're going across the eye in the posterior aspect there. So I'd venture that this is one of our obliques. And if we want to call this our posterior ciliary vessel, then it stands to reason that this is going to be our medial side and this is going to be our inferior side, making this our superior oblique heading medially. So if you have these muscles attached, great, use them to orient. If not, I wouldn't stress about it. Just kind of do your best to maintain the structure. Orientation, like I said, is not key. Ultimately, we're going to probably submit this specimen entirely. So we're going to go for our main pupil to optic nerve section. And that's kind of the biggest thing we want to get out of this. And honestly, we're going to deviate from our orientation in order to make sure we get tumor in that section if possible. Okay, so let's do a quick review of the anatomy when we see this specimen in its barrel. So the white part surrounding everything is our sclera. And remember, on the anterior aspect of the eye, that sclera is covered by that mucosa, the bulbar conjunctiva. So you can see that. We see the surrounding margin of our cornea, which is the limbus, and that sort of marks where our cornea is going to start. Let's see if you can see here. You can see the cornea is going to raise up, be that translucent section of sclera going anteriorly. You'll see the darkened portion in the center there is our pupil, and surrounded by the iris, which makes up the colored part of our eye. We already talked about the musculature. So we have superior inferior rectus, medial and lateral rectus, and then you should see superior oblique, and then this looks like inferior oblique. And then we also have the optic nerve. So in these specimens, it's nice and sort of darkened, almost black. And adjacent to that will be that posterior ciliary vessel we looked at. So when we're looking at these specimens, there's not a whole lot besides those anatomical features to be mindful of. And we're just going to measure these in 3D, and we'll measure our optic nerve in length by diameter. So let's go ahead and start the prosection for this. So when you get these specimens, the first thing you're going to do is look at your patient history. So these specimens are typically received for glaucoma in a non-malignant case. But if we're dealing with malignancies, the most common primary intraocular neoplasm is melanoma, which you wouldn't necessarily see on the external surface. But if you do, that's when we start worrying about invasion. And then we'd want to make sure we have some sort of orientation to mark our margins, as well as retinoblastoma. So those are your two common intraocular tumors. Now, typically when you get these specimens, if you can, you'll have maybe some sort of light source that you can do a transillumination for. What that means is just holding up a light so that you can beam it through the eye and try to see where you get an area of darkening that would be an indication of where your tumor is. Because that's kind of where we're going to make our plane of sectioning. Like I said, orientation isn't critical, so because of that, we can rotate this eye 360 degrees and make our section as ideal as we want to in order to make sure we get all the important components into one slice. So we'll do a transillumination to get an idea where the tumor is, and then we're going to go ahead and measure this. So for the eye component, we'll measure in 3D, so we'll say 2.7 by 2.5 by 2.3 centimeters. And then we'll measure the component of the optic nerve. So that's going to be, looks like 0.2 centimeters in length and 0.2 centimeters in diameter, so not a whole lot left. So typically with these specimens, you're going to stick it in formalin for about 48 hours. Some places will only do 24, but 48 hours, essentially 2 days, is the optimal time to get these fixed. The reason for that is once you open these specimens, the retina particularly is very prone to detaching. But we don't want that to detach during grossing because that could indicate a pathology or make us miss a pathology that might be there. Some places might try to even inject formalin or open these up to help fixation. That's a no-go. You want to just let it sit in formalin for the 48 hours, and that should be sufficient to fix everything inside and out. You don't want to make any injections into the orbit itself, and you don't want to make any incisions. Again, we don't want to disrupt that anatomy. So we will be doing this one fresh, but that is not typically the case. Just keep that in mind going forward. So let's say hypothetically we've let this sit for 48 hours in fixation. We've already transilluminated it. And let's say we notice that I'm going to make a dot on here that our tumor was in this general region there. Okay. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to ink the resection margin on my optic nerve. So that is really the biggest margin we're worried about in this case, since everything else is covered and protected by sclera. It's not a true margin. Let's go ahead and dry that off. I'm going to dry off my tumor indicator as well. So that's really the only thing you're going to be inking in these cases. Now, before you open the eye, the first thing you should do is shave off this optic nerve margin. Now, some of these eyes might have more of an optic nerve attached. I'm doing the one thing I don't like where I seesaw it. So let's just go ahead and cut. There you go. So I've got a shave, are you there? A shave of my optic nerve, and I'm going to submit that on FOSS, meaning true margin down. And I'll stick that in its own cassette. Again, we'll keep that separate because we don't want to risk contamination of the optic nerve by any sort of tumor or friable components of tumor that might be present when we open the eye itself. So that should be your first step. All right, next step, we're going to go cut into this eye. So because of the globe shape of this specimen, it means we can kind of rotate it in any direction. And then what we're ultimately aiming for is to get this optic nerve in the same plane as this pupil. And that's not inherently hard to do because they're relatively directly behind each other. Okay? So, since my tumor's here, I want to make the plane of cut this way. So let this forceps kind of indicate what my section will ultimately look like. Whereas I'm going to have to cut here and keep that pupil intact. And then if I roll this over, I'm going to try to make sure that the optic nerve is still contained in that section. All right, so now for the hardest part. Is cutting into a globe, especially with a scalpel, is not easy. This thing is filled with aqueous fluid and vitreous fluid. Remember, the vitreous fluid is going to make up most of the vitreous compartment in the eye. The aqueous fluid is going to be in our front compartment here, the anterior compartment, where our cornea is. So I typically like to make some sort of incision initially in order to relieve that pressure. So let's go ahead and try to just do that. Since we're not really worried about the sections on the side here, I'm going to do that over here. Make a cut right here. And obviously be careful. You should be wearing your lab glasses at this point. You don't want to accidentally splash vitreous fluid in your eye. So let's go ahead and make, oh, there we go. See? All right, so now that I've relieved the pressure, this should be a lot easier to work with. In fact, you might want to even flatten it down a little bit. Be careful, because underneath our pupil is going to be our lens, and we'll see that shortly. So now I'm going to go ahead and use my paddle forceps, and again, keeping our little tumor location in line. You can see that there. I want to make sure I get that section with my optic nerve posteriorly. So let's go cut one side. Honestly, this cut, the first cut that you get, oops, just got splashed again, is going to be the most difficult. And once you kind of make it in there, just try to do a nice forced slice through, okay? So what popped out here is my lens, which is kind of cool. We're going to try to keep that in our section, but for the time being, it's loose. Okay, so I've cut off one half of the eye here, and I'm left with the other half. And basically what I'm looking for now is I want this part to be contained in my cassette, so this is going to be where my pupil is, and I want to make sure that my optic nerve is contained. So as you can see, posteriorly I was a little bit off, so I can trim that up and do some adjustment after I make my section. But that means I'd rather be on that end where I have a little bit extra I want to cut off than to have cut through my optic nerve initially and have less to work with. So now we need to do the same thing, but on the other side. So again, here's my tumor, and then the optic nerve is behind it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll give myself a little bit leeway like I did with the previous side, and just kind of cut at the edge right around that limbus there. Let's see if you can see. There we go. Let's just use some pressure and cut. Okay. So this is a little too big for a section initially, but this is in theory what we're going for here. So let's go ahead and kind of mock up what we're ultimately going to do. So this is kind of the primordial pupil to optic nerve section. So I got to make sure I have my optic nerve on there, which I do. You can see that right there. And I want to make sure I have my pupil on there, which I do, right there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get this cleaned up, and then we'll come back and work on that section a little bit more. Okay, so now we've cleaned it up a little bit, and we have the section we need to work with. So some places may have specialized cassettes that are bigger and wider and thicker, and they can handle a section like this. But not us. We're still going to use the standard cassettes here. So we want to make sure that we fit that properly in here. So as it stands, it's a little too thick. You can hopefully see. So I'm going to trim it down. And there's nothing wrong with that. Now ideally, my tumor, which should be indicated with some inking, which might have gotten lost, is going to be located somewhere on the retina there. So all this black stuff on the inside is our retina. Our lens would have been right here. Now you can see part of it, so I'm going to try to include that in our cassette. You can see it did not save very well. But we have retina and sclera, and we can't really see the coronoid, which is that middle layer. So one thing I'm going to do for this, that a lot of people don't initially think is okay, but it's something you can absolutely do with your sections. So I'm going to start trimming them up. So I'll take some scissors around. And don't so I'm starting on the side that was more closer to the limbus. I'll make sure I keep that optic nerve intact. Okay. Now the goal is we have to think about how histology is going to be cutting into this section, right? So we want to make sure that if this is a pupil to optic nerve section, that the sections they're going to take are going to show the pupil and the optic nerve in it as well. Which means, let's see if we can line this up. So there's my optic nerve. There's my pupil. So I'm going to go ahead and then, now that it's nice and flat and easy to work with, I'm going to go ahead and trim the other side of this eye. And leave us with a nice thin section that contains everything we need. So let's see if you can clear it. So over here, this clear area, if you can kind of make that out, is going to be where our pupil was. And then we can flip it over, and there's our optic nerve. So I can now stick this into a cassette, knowing that I've got everything attached. I'm also going to stick my lens in there, so they can hopefully cut that and see a relationship there, at least a portion of the lens. There we go. So again, we want to make sure that we're allowing the histotext to be able to cut into the pupil and the optic nerve in the same cut, and that they don't have to go too deep to get into one or the other. And that's really the most important section with these specimens. PO section is what they call it. In a lot of places, especially if this is a glaucoma case, that section is more than enough, that and the optic nerve margin. Now, if this is for tumor, we can take the remaining portion of the eye, and this is what we're going to assume this case was. And these are referred to, these sort of partial global structures are referred to as calettes. And what we're just going to do is serially section those and submit those in cassettes as well. So let's go ahead and usually they're small enough that you can just stick them in a single cassette on edge. A little sticky there. Some of that vitreous fluid is left. And then we would do the same with the opposing side. This one is a little bit thicker, but we'll make do. Obviously, we want to make our sections as thin as possible. And here we go. When all is said and done, we should have about 4 cassettes. Again, assuming this is A for tumor, and B, we were able to fit all of our cowlets in a single cassette. But we have our optic nerve margin with an inked surface and shaved submitted on FOSS. We have our PO section, which we got to make sure has our optic nerve and our pupil in one continuous cut. And then we have our 2 cowlets, serially sectioned, submitted entirely. And that's it. So thank you for joining me, and let me know if you have any questions.